In 2001, an unseen catastrophe was confirmed. Scientists uncovered a profound and terrifying truth. A manufactured chemical, born of human industry, saturated the blood of nearly every American citizen. This contamination was not the consequence of a single catastrophic industrial accident or a battlefield deployment, but the pervasive result of a major chemical factory operating legally, year after year, in the geographic heartland of America. This compound, colorless, odorless, and causing no immediate symptomatic pain, was characterized by a singular, sinister property. It was immortal. It never broke down. This immortality was not an accident. It was a feature engineered for war. During the Manhattan Project, scientists needed a material that could withstand the corrosive uranium gas used to build the atomic bomb. They found it in the carbon-fluorine bond of Teflon components, one of the strongest bonds in organic chemistry. But this atomic resilience is exactly what makes C8 a biological nightmare. The same chemical stability that resisted uranium corrosion means it resists the natural processes of the human body. It doesn't digest, it doesn't break down, it accumulates. DuPont took a chemical designed to survive a nuclear program and injected it into the human bloodstream, where, just like the waste from the bomb, it refuses to die. Scientists branded it a forever chemical, later classified within the broader family of PFAS, per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And the epicenter of this molecular invasion was a single facility, the Washington Works plant. The true horror was not the chemical's existence, but the timeline of deception that accompanied it. For 64 years, from 1951 until 2015, the DuPont chemical plant, known as Washington Works in West Virginia, systematically released an estimated 1.7 million pounds of perfluorooctanoic acid, PFOA, internally dubbed C8, into the environment. This industrial discharge flowed into the Ohio River, a primary source of drinking water for over 70,000 people. It aerosolized into the air breathed by surrounding communities and seeped into the soil where their children played baseball. DuPont had conclusive proof of PFOA's toxicity by 1961. They commissioned internal studies, meticulously tracked elevated levels in workers' blood, and even documented birth defects among employees' children. Yet, production and the subsequent dumping continued unabated. The central question is therefore not one of mistake, but of calculated survival. What happens when a global corporation possesses definitive knowledge that its product causes systemic harm, but determines that stopping the process is simply too expensive? This was not a fleeting industrial disaster marked by a flash and sirens. This was a crime of insidious patience, quiet towns beside rivers that seemed pristine, and human bodies slowly becoming permanent repositories for molecules designed to resist decay. What is fundamentally more dangerous than an explosion? A biological trespass so gradual and invisible that victims are poisoned over decades without ever tasting, seeing, or smelling the contaminant. Accountability becomes impossible when the damage inflicted is, by definition, eternal. This is not a story of corporate negligence. It is the chronicle of a measured, clinical betrayal. DuPont's records confirm the calculation. They studied PFOA's effects on laboratory animals and tracked the contamination as it spread inexorably into vital groundwater supplies. In 1984, an internal memo starkly outlined the economics. Installing a basic water treatment and filtration system to mitigate the C8 outflow would cost approximately $12 million per year. The resulting decision, recorded in the company's confidential documents, was chillingly simple, not economically attractive. They chose profit, maximizing revenue for 64 years, every single working day. In the end, no executives went to prison. The corporation ultimately paid a $671 million settlement to resolve thousands of lawsuits, a sum equivalent to less than 3% of the company's annual revenue from just one single product line during that era. DuPont then reorganized, shifted its structure, changed corporate names, and continued operations. Today, the factory still stands. The chemical contamination it left behind will endure for thousands of years, and the molecular consequences may still reside within the tissue of those who read this story. The clinical betrayal of the 21st century was not an isolated lapse in judgment. It was the refined result of a DNA encoded 200 years ago. Chapter 2: Blood and Gunpowder. To comprehend this dark sequence of events, one must understand the foundation of the DuPont dynasty. The story begins on January 1, 1800, when Eleuthère Irénée DuPont arrived in America from France. He was 29, carrying $36,000 in capital secured from French investors, and more crucially, bearing specialized knowledge of gunpowder chemistry learned under the tutelage of Antoine Lavoisier, the father of modern chemistry. By July 19, 1802, DuPont had established his enterprise, purchasing 95 acres along the Brandywine Creek in Delaware and founding Eleutherian Mills. But the mortar holding these stones together may have been mixed with something far darker than river mud. Historians have long scrutinized the true source of the family's rapid liquidity, pointing to a dirty money connection that official timelines omit. The DuPonts cultivated a deep commercial alliance with John Jacob Astor, America's first multi-millionaire, whose American Fur Company was a primary client for their gunpowder. However, Astor's empire was notoriously fueled by the opium trade into China. The disturbing allegation is that the DuPont patriarchs weren't just innocent suppliers. They were navigating the murky waters of global narcotics to secure their dynasty's footing. It suggests an original sin of illicit capital, that the American dream on the Brandywine was built, in part, on the proceeds of addiction abroad. The struggling startup found its lifeline in a shadowy alliance. Historical records confirm that one of DuPont's first and most critical regular customers was none other than John Jacob Astor and his American Fur Company. While official histories call this a business transaction, investigative historians see a darker synergy. DuPont provided the gunpowder that Astor needed to violently carve out his empire in the American West. In return, Astor provided the liquidity that kept the DuPont mills running. It was a partnership forged in black powder, one empire built on supplying the explosive force for the other's conquest. Within a decade, the company was America's preeminent gunpowder manufacturer. However, war is chaotic. While company president Henry DuPont was a staunch Union loyalist who strictly forbade sales to the rebels, he could not control the black market. Historical records show massive amounts of DuPont munitions were seized or smuggled into Confederate hands. The grim irony was unavoidable. Despite the family's fierce political allegiance to the North, their product inevitably fueled the cannon fire from both sides. The Civil War solidified DuPont's dominance, supplying between 1/3 and 1/2 of the Union Army's explosive needs. But in the chaotic, unregulated markets of war, the product often outruns the politics. While company president Henry DuPont was a staunch public unionist who forbade sales to the rebels, the reality on the ground was far murkier. Historical ledgers reveal that through seizures and a shadow network of Southern agents, massive quantities of DuPont powder crossed enemy lines. In 1863 alone, the company wrote off $110,000, a staggering fortune at the time, in munitions lost to the South. It was a grim irony of the arms trade. Regardless of the family's allegiance, their black powder was fueling the cannon fire from both sides of the battlefield, killing Americans indiscriminately while cementing the dynasty's industrial supremacy. And back home on the Brandywine, the cost of this rapid expansion was paid in blood. The mills were essentially ticking time bombs. While the official history records 288 explosions and 228 worker deaths, the danger was so absolute that it did not spare the dynasty itself. Alexis Irénée DuPont, a partner in the firm, died in a fireball trying to save the works in 1857. This was an empire built not just on chemical innovation, but on the acceptance that human collateral, whether a soldier in Virginia or a family member in Delaware, was an inevitable line item in the pursuit of dominance. By 1881, the company effectively monopolized 85% of the U.S. explosives market. But while the company conquered the nation's markets, it was fighting a literal war within its own walls. This early success came at a lethal cost. Between 1802 and 1921, 288 documented explosions killed 228 workers. But in those early days, the blood price was shared. Eleuthère Irénée DuPont, the founder, built his own family home right on the banks of the Brandywine, directly facing the powder mills. It was a statement of ultimate accountability. If the factory exploded, the owner's family would face the blast alongside the workers. This was the shared risk doctrine of the 19th century. However, as the dynasty grew, that doctrine vanished. 2 centuries later, the executives making decisions about C8 didn't live in the blast zone. They lived in climate-controlled safety, while they exported the risk to the unsuspecting families of the Ohio River Valley. The shared risk had mutated into transferred risk, a moral shift that would prove far deadlier than black powder. Yet, DuPont mastered the art of reputation management, paying generous pensions to widows, rebuilding communities, and cultivating an image of a responsible, if paternalistic, industrial giant. But behind the limestone walls of their estates, a darker form of consolidation was taking place. To ensure their immense wealth would never be diluted by outsiders, the family practiced a strategic pattern of endogamy throughout the 19th century. Cousins married cousins with alarming regularity, a calculated effort to keep the fortune within the bloodline. This insularity bred not just loyalty, but a terrifying biological secrecy. Historians like Leonard Mosley have alleged that family archivists systematically purged diaries and medical records to hide the freaks in the bloodline, the genetic consequences of this inbreeding. It was the dynasty's first lesson in containment. Keep the money inside, keep the secrets inside, and destroy the records of anything that looks like a defect. This obsession with purity and silence would later become the very operating system of their chemical empire. This biological isolation was matched by a financial one, creating a system where the family's wealth became as indestructible as their chemical bonds. Chapter 3: The Financial Fortress. World War I provided the ultimate stress test for this new fortress. While the world burned, DuPont's war profits reached levels that were previously unthinkable, providing the massive capital needed to shed their centuries-old skin as the merchants of death. As the guns fell silent, the leadership realized that sustained dominance required a pivot from the battlefield to the American household. They didn't just want to supply the military, they wanted to own the future. This transition birthed an era of unprecedented scientific hubris and consumer euphoria, creating what historians call the halo of miracles. The foundation of this halo was laid in the 1920s when DuPont made a radical bet on pure research, hiring Wallace Carothers to explore the mysteries of polymers. In 1935, Carothers struck gold with nylon, a synthetic fiber made from coal, water, and air. The debut of nylon was not just a product launch, it was a cultural explosion. The nylon riots of 1940 proved that DuPont had successfully turned base chemicals into social status. But the true weight of their scientific might was reserved for the shadow of World War II, where nylon was repurposed for paratroopers, and a new, accidental miracle was brewing in the lab: Teflon. At first, Teflon was a solution looking for a problem. That problem arrived with the Manhattan Project. The scientists building the atomic bomb faced a nightmare: uranium hexafluoride gas. It was so corrosive it would eat through almost any metal or gasket, leaking the precious material needed for the bomb. DuPont's secret new polymer was the only substance on Earth that could withstand the assault. Teflon became the silent guardian of the nuclear age, lining the pipes of the K-25 facility in Oak Ridge. Without DuPont's miracle, the Trinity test might never have happened. By 1950, DuPont had become more than a company, it was an American institution. They were the largest employer in Delaware, wielded immense political power in Washington, and were the ultimate architects of the post-war American way of life. Their slogan, "Better Living Through Chemistry," wasn't just a marketing line, it was a national mantra. This era saw the birth of a reservoir of public trust so deep it was effectively bottomless. Every time an American used a non-stick Teflon pan, wore a neoprene wetsuit, or looked through a Mylar sheet, they were interacting with a DuPont miracle. This trust created an unshakable shield of cognitive dissonance. In the public mind,
DuPont was the kindly provider of safety and convenience. They sponsored Little League teams, funded hospitals, and their scientists were the wizards of Wilmington. But beneath this glossy veneer, the halo of miracles served a darker purpose. It created a psychological barrier that made scrutiny feel like heresy.
If DuPont brought us the fiber that saved paratroopers and the material that built the bomb, how could they be anything but benevolent? This halo blinded the public, and even the government, to the reality of what was happening inside their laboratories. While the world was blinded by the halo of miracles, a second, more impenetrable fortress was being constructed behind the limestone walls of Wilmington, Delaware. If nylon and Teflon were the sword of the DuPont empire, their financial architecture was the shield. To understand how a corporation could knowingly poison 70,000 people for 64 years without a single executive facing a prison cell, one must understand the financial bunker, a legal reality where profit is privatized and risk is socialized. The foundation of this bunker was not made of concrete, but of laws. For the DuPonts, the state of Delaware was never just a place of business, it was a sovereign laboratory. By the mid-20th century, the family had become the state's largest employer and its most potent political force. They didn't just follow the law, they helped refine it to suit the needs of a multi-generational dynasty. This influence culminated in a specialized legal engine known as the Dynasty Trust. Historically, American law followed a common law doctrine known as the rule against perpetuities. It was designed to prevent wealthy families from hoarding land and money forever, dictating that a trust must eventually expire so wealth could flow back into the economy. But in 1995, with quiet but surgical precision, Delaware repealed this rule. This move effectively granted the DuPont fortune a version of the immortality they had engineered into their chemicals. In this bunker, money, like PFOA, never had to break down. The genius of the Dynasty Trust lies in its definition of ownership. In the DuPont bunker, the family members technically own nothing. The billions are held by the trust, classified as a discretionary interest. Legally, this creates an unbreakable firewall. Even if the DuPont Corporation faces bankruptcy or billion-dollar environmental judgments, the family's core personal wealth remains untouchable. Creditors and victims cannot seize what the heirs do not own. This financial bunker was the silent engine behind the Washington Works plant. When DuPont's internal scientists recorded the toxicity of C8, the decision-making process was already pre-programmed by this architecture. They were operating from within a climate-controlled safety zone, while exporting the biological risk to the unsuspecting families of the Ohio River Valley. The shared risk doctrine of the 19th century, where the founder lived next to the powder mill, had been completely replaced by transferred risk. They had built a system where the company absorbs the liability, while the bloodline keeps the loot, forever immune to the ruin they exported to the public. The financial bunker provided the structural walls, but it was the DNA of impunity that directed the soul of the empire. To understand the DuPont story, one must recognize that for 2 centuries, the family and the corporation operated under a singular, unspoken conviction, that they were not merely participants in the American experiment, but its architects, and therefore the rules of the common man did not apply to them. This sense of exceptionalism wasn't just corporate arrogance, it was a biological and cultural mandate, reinforced by decades of secrecy and a 2-tiered justice system that seemed to bend whenever a DuPont name was whispered in court. This DNA first manifested in the 19th century through a strategic pattern of endogamy. To keep the immense wealth from leaking out to the public, the DuPonts practiced cousin marriage with clinical regularity. This insularity bred a terrifying culture of containment. Family archivists were known to purge medical records and diaries to hide the genetic consequences of this inbreeding. Anything that looked like a defect was erased to maintain the illusion of a perfect bloodline. This was the dynasty's first lesson in toxic management. If a problem exists, hide it. If the evidence is damning, destroy it. This obsession with purity and secrecy became the very operating system of their chemical empire. When they later discovered the toxicity of C8, they didn't see a public health crisis. They saw a defect in their product that needed to be contained within confidential files, just as they had contained the secrets of their own blood for generations. By the late 20th century, this internal culture of impunity began to explode into the public sphere, revealing a family that had become so insulated by wealth that they had lost touch with human reality. The most haunting example was the case of John Eleuthère DuPont. As a billionaire heir, John lived in a world where no one ever said no. At his Foxcatcher estate, he descended into a nightmare of paranoid delusions, brandishing military-grade weapons and claiming to see spies in his walls. Despite his increasingly dangerous behavior, the local police, largely funded by DuPont donations, hesitated to intervene. The halo of the family name acted as a paralyzing agent for the law. In 1996, when John murdered Olympic gold medalist Dave Schultz in cold blood, the world finally saw the terminal stage of unchecked impunity. It was the clinical betrayal of a man who believed that his name was a license to kill. However, if John DuPont was seen as a lone wolf driven by madness, the 2009 case of Robert Richards IV proved that the system itself was designed to protect the bloodline at any cost. Richards, a direct heir to the fortune, was convicted of sexually assaulting his own 3-year-old daughter. In any other corner of America, this crime would result in decades of imprisonment. Yet, in a Delaware courtroom, a judge spared him from serving even a single day behind bars. The judge's reasoning was chillingly direct. The wealthy heir would not fare well in prison. This calculation, that the comfort of a DuPont outweighed the suffering of a victim, was the exact same logic applied at the Washington Works plant in West Virginia. Just as the judicial system decided it was not socially attractive to punish a DuPont for destroying a child, the corporation decided it was not economically attractive to spend $12 million to save 70,000 people from PFOA poisoning. In the world of DuPont, the name must be protected, and the consequences are always for other people. This DNA of impunity created a corporate environment where silence was a prerequisite for survival. But this culture of untouchability didn't stay behind the closed doors of family mansions. It leaked into the very soil of their industrial operations. If a DuPont heir could be shielded from the crimes of the nursery, then a DuPont factory could certainly be shielded from the crimes of the environment. The immunity was absolute, and the cost was always transferred to those who served the empire. At the Washington Works facility, the workers, many of them multi-generational DuPont employees, were locked in a cycle of paternalistic dependence. The company sponsored their little league teams, funded their schools, and paid wages that were double the local average. This created a psychological barrier more effective than any barbed wire fence. To question the company was to bite the hand that fed your children. It was a molecular form of gaslighting. How could the company that gave us nylon, the material of heroes, be the same company that was quietly causing birth defects in the nursery? The executives in Wilmington viewed the contamination of the Ohio River Valley not as a moral failing, but as a manageable liability. They had the best lawyers money could buy, a home field advantage in the Delaware courts, and a financial bunker that shielded their personal billions. They possessed a clinical detachment from the consequences of their chemistry. To them, the 1.7 million pounds of C8 released into the environment were just numbers on a balance sheet. This is the ultimate legacy of the DNA of impunity. It is the belief that with enough money, enough influence, and enough secrecy, a dynasty can transcend the laws of nature and man. They assumed that the miracles of the past would forever blind the world to the crimes of the present. They built a world where they were the masters of time and chemistry, forgetting that while a dynasty trust might last forever, so does the poison in the water. The DNA of the family had met the immortality of the chemical, and together, they had created a catastrophe that no bunker could truly contain. With the bunker built and the DNA of silence encoded, the stage was set for the empire's grandest expansion. The destination was a place where the air tasted of copper and the water held a secret: Parkersburg, West Virginia. But it was in the rolling hills of Parkersburg, West Virginia, that this system of calculated betrayal found its physical manifestation. In 1948, DuPont opened the Washington Works plant, a sprawling 1,200-acre industrial marvel along the banks of the Ohio River. To the local community, it wasn't just a factory. It was a secular cathedral of progress. It represented the American dream made manifest in steel and steam, promising stability, prosperity, and a ticket to the middle class for generations of Appalachian families. But beneath the immaculate safety awards and the celebratory company picnics, A silent invasion was underway, a molecular occupation of the land, the water, and the very bodies of the people who called it home. By the early 1950s, Washington Works had become the global epicenter for the production of Teflon. As consumer demand for non-stick pans skyrocketed, the facility's output surged past 2 million pounds annually. However, the manufacturing process required a specialized processing aid, perfluorooctanoic acid, or C8. DuPont didn't invent C8, 3M did, but DuPont became its most prolific user. From the very beginning, the plant's design treated the environment not as a resource to be protected, but as a vast, unpaid disposal system. The Ohio River, the lifeblood of the valley, providing drinking water to over 70,000 people, became a convenient drainpipe for toxic effluent. The tragedy of Washington Works was not a sudden explosion or a visible leak. It was an insidious patience. It was a slow-motion poisoning that lasted for 64 years. DuPont's internal records, later uncovered in litigation, reveal a chilling information asymmetry. While the company's public relations department was sponsoring Little League teams and refurbishing high school chemistry labs, their scientists at the Haskell Laboratory were documenting a terrifying reality. As early as 1961, DuPont had conclusive proof that C8 was toxic. By the 1970s, they knew it accumulated in human blood and stayed there for years. By the 1980s, they had documented birth defects in the children of their own female employees. Yet, the smokestacks kept billowing, and the drainpipes kept flowing. The social architecture of Parkersburg ensured that this secret remained buried. DuPont was the undisputed gravitational center of the regional economy. They paid wages that were nearly double the local average, provided full benefits, and secured the retirements of thousands. In a region often forgotten by the march of progress, DuPont was the provider. This created a profound psychological barrier for the community. You did not bite the hand that feeds you. If a worker noticed a strange smell in the air or a discoloration in the water, they were often silenced by the economic fear of losing their livelihood or the social pressure of being seen as anti-DuPont. This silence allowed the contamination to become total. The C8 didn't just stay in the river. It aerosolized into the air breathed by residents and seeped into the groundwater where children played. The 6 surrounding communities, Parkersburg, Little Hocking, Lubeck, and others, became a vast, involuntary laboratory. Pregnant women unknowingly passed the forever chemical to their fetuses through the placenta. Children in the Ohio River Valley were born already contaminated, their blood carrying the molecular legacy of a corporation they hadn't even heard of yet. It was a biological trespass of the highest order, a violation of the most fundamental human right, the right to an unpoisoned life. The operational logic of the financial bunker dictated the company's response to this mounting crisis. In 1984, DuPont executives held a secret meeting to discuss the C8 problem. They had detected the chemical in the local drinking water at levels they knew were dangerous. They calculated that installing a specialized carbon filtration system to scrub the C8 from the water would cost approximately $12 million. In a world governed by human ethics, this would have been a mandatory expense. But in the world of DuPont, governed by the cold calculus of the not economically attractive doctrine, the decision was made to do nothing. They determined that the potential legal liability in the future was a price worth paying for the profits of the present. For 40 years, this silent invasion continued unabated. The people of the Ohio River Valley drank the water, bathed their children, and watered their gardens, oblivious to the fact that they were becoming permanent repositories for a chemical designed to resist decay. Accountability seemed impossible. The corporation possessed the data, the money, and the political influence to keep the veil of secrecy intact. They assumed the DNA of impunity would protect them forever, and that the halo of miracles would keep the public looking at their Teflon pans rather than the river. But they had overlooked one crucial factor: the land itself. In the late 1990s, the molecular betrayal finally broke through the surface on a small farm owned by Wilbur Tennant. His cattle were dying in ways that science couldn't explain, foaming at the mouth, organs turning black, and eyes glazed with a blue tint. Tennant didn't have a PhD in chemistry or a dynasty trust, but he had a video camera and a refusal to be silenced. The DuPont bunker was built to survive lawyers, politicians, and taxes, but it was never designed to survive a man who had nothing left to lose. The silent invasion was over. The war had just begun. But to understand the poison in Wilbur's cattle, we must first look at the miracle in DuPont's laboratory. Chapter 4: The Miracle and the Secret. Before Teflon became a kitchen staple, it was a classified military secret born from a scientific anomaly. Its discovery wasn't a stroke of genius, but a frustrating mistake that happened inside DuPont's Jackson laboratory in Deepwater, New Jersey. The date was April 6, 1938. A young chemist named Roy Plunkett and his assistant, Jack Reebok, were staring at a pressurized cylinder that defied the laws of physics. They had filled it with tetrafluoroethylene, TFE, gas, and stored it on dry ice. But when they opened the valve, nothing came out. The tank still had mass, it was heavy, but the pressure was gone. The gas had vanished. Driven by confusion, they took a hacksaw and cut the metal canister open. Inside, they didn't find gas. They found the interior coated in a strange, white, waxy powder. The cold had caused the gas molecules to spontaneously link together, polymerizing into something the world had never seen. Plunkett touched it. It was slippery, waxy, yet hard. He tried to burn it, it wouldn't melt. He poured acid on it, it wouldn't dissolve. He had accidentally created polytetrafluoroethylene, PTFE, the most chemically inert substance on Earth. It was a material that rejected the world, nothing could stick to it, and nothing could destroy it. For 4 years, this white powder was a solution looking for a problem. That problem arrived with the Manhattan Project. General Leslie Groves needed to contain the viciously corrosive uranium hexafluoride gas used to build the atomic bomb. Every seal they tried dissolved, except for Plunkett's accidental powder. DuPont's miracle didn't start by frying eggs. It started by enriching uranium for the weapon that would end World War II. With the war over and the material declassified, DuPont owned a powerful trademark, registered in 1944, but needed a peacetime market. Commercial production began in 1946, initially targeting specialized industrial applications, chemical equipment gaskets, wire insulation for aerospace, and components for high-temperature electronics. Then, in 1954, a French engineer named Marc Gregoire, at his wife's suggestion, coated a frying pan with Teflon. He created the first commercial non-stick cookware. The consumer revolution arrived in the US by 1961 with the Happy Pan. By 1965, Teflon was a fixture in millions of American kitchens, coating frying pans, baking sheets, and waffle irons. Marketing centered on modern convenience, effortless cooking, no oil needed, and instant cleanup. Sales skyrocketed, from 500,000 coated pans sold in 1960 to 15 million in 1970. By 1980, 90% of American households owned Teflon cookware. The brand name became generic, a cultural metaphor synonymous with invulnerability, as when Ronald Reagan was called the Teflon president because criticism simply wouldn't stick. Behind this cultural icon lay a hidden industrial necessity, a chemical secret that made the non-stick dream a reality, but at a terrible environmental cost. For DuPont, Teflon was the ultimate proof of concept, generating over $1 billion in annual revenue by the 1980s. It was the physical manifestation of better living through chemistry. Washington Works was the showcase, and its workers felt they were building the future. But Teflon's triumph relied on a secret requirement, a technical problem consumers never knew existed. PTFE particles do not naturally remain suspended in water during the critical polymerization process. They clump and sink, ruining the batch. Industrial-scale production of high-quality Teflon was impossible without a specific chemical surfactant. In 1951, DuPont began purchasing this essential processing aid from 3M Corporation. Its chemical name, perfluorooctanoic acid, or PFOA. DuPont's internal name, C8, referring to the 8 carbon atoms in its molecular chain. C8's function was simple and vital. Its dual structure, a hydrophobic, water-repelling tail and a hydrophilic, water-attracting head, allowed it to encapsulate the PTFE particles, creating a protective shell that kept them evenly dispersed throughout the water solution. Without C8, the economic viability of the entire Teflon industry vanished. It was not optional, it was the key to commercial success. Thousands of pounds of C8 were consumed annually, used in every single batch of Teflon produced. Trace amounts remained in the finished product, and when cookware was overheated, above 500 degrees Fahrenheit, C8 could off-gas into the kitchen air. What consumers were told: Teflon is safe and chemically inert. What DuPont knew: C8 was toxic, it bioaccumulated aggressively in blood, and it would never degrade in the environment. The production process generated massive amounts of contaminated wastewater laden with C8. This water had to be disposed of, and DuPont faced three clear economic options. High-temperature incineration required breaking the carbon-fluorine bonds, costing $12 to $15 million annually. Activated carbon filtration required filtering the water and shipping the contaminated filters to hazardous waste facilities, costing $6 to $8 million annually. Groundwater and river dumping, pumping the waste into unlined storage ponds and directly into the Ohio River. Cost: approximately $75,000 annually. The 1984 internal memo provided the final verdict. Choosing the path of minimal expenditure, contaminated water was directed into unlined digestion ponds, where it seeped into the groundwater, was pumped through outfall pipes directly into the Ohio River, and was released as vapor from the plant's smokestacks. Between 1951 and 2003, DuPont pumped 632,468 pounds of C8 directly into the river and dumped 7,100 tons of C8-laced sludge into unlined pits. The exposure was insidious. C8 entered human bodies through contaminated drinking water, inhalation of particulate matter, and the food chain as plants absorbed it from the soil and livestock consumed contaminated feed. Since C8 had no smell or taste, there were no immediate symptoms, only slow, molecular accumulation. C8 molecules bound tightly to blood proteins, building up inexorably in liver and kidney tissues. The poisoning spread for decades because DuPont controlled the flow of information, suppressing test results of river water, keeping worker blood data confidential, and deciding at the executive level that the price of prevention was too steep. In the 1990s, when the contamination was still hidden, its effects were already visible on Wilbur tenants' dying cattle. To grasp the enormity of the contamination endured by 70,000 people and Wilbur's herd, one must understand C8 not merely as a chemical, but as a geological material, a structure built to outlast human civilization. It is an 8-carbon chain where almost every hydrogen atom usually found attached to the carbon backbone has been replaced by fluorine. This creates an impenetrable shield of fluorine atoms, protecting the carbon core from ever breaking down. In nature, organic life is based on carbon-hydrogen (CH) bonds, found in proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. CH bonds are relatively weak, allowing bacteria, enzymes, and environmental oxidation to easily break them down. This is the chemistry of life and decay. The carbon-fluorine (CF) bond is fundamentally different. It is the strongest bond in organic chemistry. Breaking it requires extraordinary energy that simply does not exist in standard biological or environmental conditions. Consequently, no bacteria can digest PFOA. No enzyme can cleave it. No environmental process can decompose it. The molecule is, for all practical purposes, indestructible. Scientists conservatively estimate PFOA's environmental half-life at thousands of years. The chemical has not existed long enough to accurately measure its full decay rate. It may truly last for tens of thousands of years. In the human body, the half-life is measured at 3.8 years. If you ingest C8 today, 50% will still be in your blood 3.8 years from now. This permanence is not theoretical. It is a molecular reality. Combine this permanence with bioaccumulation. C8 is amphiphilic, part water-repelling, part water-attracting. This dual nature prevents the body from simply flushing it out. Instead, it binds tenaciously to serum albumin in the blood and concentrates in the liver and kidneys. Every exposure adds to the existing burden. The molecule ingested last year is still actively circulating. Decades of drinking contaminated water resulted in a permanent body burden of C8 that would remain for the rest of a person's life. DuPont established this reality by 1970. The company had been testing workers' blood since 1961. The data showed universally elevated PFOA levels among C8 handlers, and critically, those levels did not decrease even when workers took weeks of leave. The chemical was not being metabolized or excreted effectively. Workers were human storage tanks, and the company continued using the chemical for 45 more years. The first warnings were decades earlier. In 1951, when DuPont began purchasing C8 from 3M, initial toxicity screening, standard protocols involving rats and rabbits, showed moderate acute toxicity and liver enlargement at low doses. 3M recommended avoiding inhalation and skin contact. By 1961, DuPont's own Haskell laboratory conducted more extensive 90-day studies on rats, dogs, and rabbits. The results confirmed severe liver damage, elevated liver enzymes, eye damage, and corneal opacity. 2 dogs given oral doses died within 48 hours. The report concluded, stamped confidential, PFOA is highly toxic when inhaled and moderately toxic when ingested. Long-term effects unknown. Recommend limiting worker exposure. DuPont's immediate response was limited. They set an internal exposure limit, required better ventilation, and initiated a worker blood monitoring program. They did not reduce C8 usage, did not install wastewater filtration, and did not notify regulatory agencies, like the EPA, which was not yet created, or surrounding communities. Better ventilation was simply cheaper than changing the process. The scope widened in 1968 when environmental researchers globally detected organofluorine compounds in general population blood serum. Chemicals that should not have been present in humans were showing up everywhere. DuPont's internal blood monitoring confirmed the source by 1969. Every worker handling C8 had PFOA concentrations up to 100 times higher than the general population, and the levels were permanent. The company tracked this damning data for over 2 decades without publishing it, disclosing it to regulators, or explaining the health implications to the workers. By 1979, Haskell Laboratory completed its most comprehensive animal study yet. The results were detailed, specific, and devastating. Profound liver damage even at low doses, persistent eye damage, respiratory trauma, and multiple rapid deaths in test animals. The report was internally stamped confidential, do not distribute. This was the documented foundation of knowledge held internally by DuPont. The chemical was highly toxic, it was indestructible, and the human body was incapable of eliminating it. The report documenting the lethal toxicity, the indestructible nature, and the irreversible bioaccumulation of C8 was not distributed. The warning was systematically quarantined, not to regulators responsible for public safety, not to the scientific community who might have raised alarm, not to the workers whose blood was already being monitored internally, and certainly not to the downstream communities drawing their daily water supply from the contaminated river. The wall of silence cracked in the summer of 1981. DuPont's internal medical department, routinely reviewing worker health data, flagged a disturbing trend among female employees in the Teflon division. Of the 7 babies born to women working in Teflon production between 1979 and 1981, 2 presented with severe eye defects. 2 out of 7. The statistical probability of such a cluster occurring by random chance was, by definition, remote. The conclusion was unavoidable. Something within the production environment was causing birth defects. DuPont's immediate decisive response was purely internal. All female workers were pulled from the Teflon division production line instantly. Yet, this internal quarantine was matched by external denial. They did not inform male workers whose partners could become pregnant. They did not inform the wider workforce, who continued to handle the chemical. They did not alert the community. They did not report the findings to any government agency. And critically, they did not halt the use of C8. One of those children was Buck Bailey, born with severe facial deformities, including only one functional nostril. His mother had worked at the plant throughout her pregnancy. His childhood would be defined by multiple complex reconstructive surgeries, leaving his face permanently affected. Decades later, Buck Bailey would stand in a courtroom, his scarred face a visible, living exhibit of the chemical's capability for damage. But in 1981, his birth defect was simply documented, filed, and stamped confidential. By 1982, DuPont had confirmed C8 toxicity in humans, not merely laboratory animals. The company now possessed incontrovertible evidence of harm. Animal studies showed organ damage, blood monitoring showed continuous bioaccumulation in employees, and now, documented birth defects in workers' children. The corporation faced a clear moral and financial choice: cease using C8 or continue production, knowing the hazard. In the spring of 1984, water monitoring detected C8 in the Ohio River. The measured levels were 8 times higher than the normal background concentration. The contamination was meticulously traced back to the Washington Works discharge pipes. An internal meeting was convened to debate the company's response. 3 options were weighed. Option 1. Stop C8 usage immediately. Estimated cost, over $50 million. Production of Teflon would halt while non-toxic alternatives were developed. Option 2. Install advanced water filtration and treatment systems. Initial capital cost, $12 million, plus $1.5 million per year in maintenance. This would capture the chemical. Option 3. Continue as is. Monitor the situation, conduct minimal defensive studies. Estimated cost, 0. The decision, recorded in the meeting minutes, was cold, clear, and based purely on optimization of shareholder value. Option 3 was chosen. The contamination continued unabated. The memo confirming this decision remains a chilling testament to corporate calculation. Reducing C8 emissions is not economically attractive. The pattern of internal knowledge and external suppression continued throughout the decade. In 1989, DuPont employees analyzing worker health data found statistically elevated leukemia deaths at Washington Works, followed shortly by an elevated number of kidney cancers among male workers. These increases were plant-wide, affecting employees across various roles, not just those handling C8 directly. The implication of widespread exposure was massive. The findings were documented, filed, and never disclosed. To rationalize away these dying workers, the company relied on a statistical mirage known as the healthy worker effect. Internal studies boasted that DuPont employees actually had a 30% lower overall mortality rate than the general U.S. population, using this data to argue their factory was safe. But this was a calculated deception. Working populations are always statistically healthier than the general public because the gravely ill and the elderly cannot hold factory jobs. By comparing their active, fit workforce to a national average that includes the dying and disabled, DuPont diluted the poison in the data. They used the natural vitality of their own labor force to mask the specific, lethal spikes in kidney cancer and other diseases among those handling C8. Essentially, they used the strength of their workers' bodies to hide the very chemicals that were slowly destroying them. In 1993, DuPont chemists successfully developed a slightly safer alternative to C8, a compound that would reduce toxicity by 30 to 40%. The decision was swift: do not switch. The stated rationale, recorded in an internal memo, cited concerns about effectiveness and profit impact. By 1999, DuPont knew C8 caused tumors, testicular, pancreatic, and liver, in laboratory animals. All evidence of its toxicity, bioaccumulation, and likely carcinogenicity had mounted over 33 years of production, 1961 to 1993. Over 44 years, 1951 to 1995, they had released 1.7 million pounds of the chemical into the environment, into the river, the ground, and the air. From there, it had migrated into human bodies, turning people into permanent, living storage units for a molecule that would never break down, never disappear, and never leave. Teflon was a miracle of chemistry, but its waste presented a crisis of capital, and DuPont's solution was to let the public pay the hidden price. Chapter 5: The Economics of Poison. The question of where 0.7 million pounds of C8 went is not answered by ignorance, but by methodology, not by accident, but by a precise system. Every disposal method was a cost-analyzed choice. Every pathway of release was approved. This was managed poisoning. Washington Works ran continuously, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Every batch of Teflon generated thousands of gallons of contaminated wastewater containing high concentrations of C8. The disposal had been engineered with lethal precision. Internal reports documented the three main options, focusing on cost analysis and engineering feasibility. The corporation faced a binary choice between public safety and profit margins. Internal engineering reports presented a clear path to safety: high-temperature incineration. This process would break the indestructible carbon-fluorine bonds, but it came with a price tag of $1.2 million annually. Instead of paying for safety, executives chose a darker path. They realized that dumping the toxic sludge directly into the Ohio River would cost virtually nothing, barely $75,000 a year in electricity for the pumps. It wasn't a dilemma, it was a cold calculation. They rejected the expensive filtration systems and chose direct discharge, effectively turning the region's drinking water into a free toxic waste disposal system. 4 words that quietly condemned 70,000 unsuspecting people. History would prove this cold calculation correct. Decades later, when DuPont finally agreed to pay $671 million to settle thousands of lawsuits, it sounded like a fortune to the public. But to the corporation, it represented less than 3% of a single year's revenue. By choosing to pollute rather than filter, they had turned a 64-year crime into a manageable business expense. The wastewater flowed into 4 distinct pathways from the factory floor to the human body. Pathway 1, the digestion ponds. 6 large unlined pits on the Washington Works property. DuPont documents used the euphemistic term digestion ponds, implying biological treatment. In reality, they were open holes in the ground with dirt bottoms and no barriers. Over 5 decades, 7,100 tons of C8-laden sludge were dumped into these ponds. The liquid seeped straight down, unhindered, into the groundwater table, which flowed inevitably toward the Ohio River aquifer, the primary source of water for residential neighborhoods. DuPont held permits for settling ponds, permits that assumed the ponds were for temporary holding of water, not the permanent dumping of toxic sludge. C8 was never listed on the permit applications, the material safety data sheets, or the annual reports to environmental agencies. The system was legally compliant, but factually a toxic waste operation. Pathway 2, the Ohio River discharge. Outfall pipes ran continuously from the plant directly into the river. This discharge was legally permitted under the Clean Water Act. The critical loophole: the permit specified limits only for regulated chemicals, such as heavy metals and known conventional pollutants. C8 was not a regulated chemical, therefore, no limits applied. The discharge was unlimited. An estimated 632,468 pounds of C8 were pumped directly into the Ohio River between 1951 and 2003. The river flowed south past Parkersburg, Little Hocking, and Lubeck. 3 miles downstream, 12 miles downstream, public water districts drew their supply. The standard municipal water treatment, filtration, chlorination, removed bacteria and sediment, but did not remove C8. The indestructible molecule passed through the treatment plants utterly unchanged, entering the distribution system, filling the taps, and flowing into the glasses of 70,000 people daily for decades. DuPont monitored the river water internally. Company documents from the 1980s onward show they knew the concentrations and knew which downstream water districts were affected. They never informed the water districts, never notified residents, and never disclosed the data to state environmental agencies. The monitoring data was always marked internal use only. Pathway 3, smokestack emissions. C8 vaporizes at the high temperatures used in Teflon production. Ventilation systems captured some, but the rest went up the smokestacks, tall steel towers designed to disperse the emissions high into the atmosphere, based on the theory of dilution. The belief was that releasing the vapor high enough would disperse it so widely that ground-level concentrations would be negligible. The reality: what goes up must come down. Of all these pathways, the most direct betrayal occurred not through a pipe or a stack, but through a simple real estate transaction with a neighbor. C8 vapor cooled, condensed into invisible particulates, and settled across the landscape. On residential properties, agricultural land, school playgrounds, and drinking water reservoirs. Wind patterns carried the emissions toward Little Hocking and Lubeck. The particulates fell like an invisible, decades-long snow, accumulating in the soil, being absorbed by plants, and entering the food chain. No external monitoring was required, and DuPont took no official measurements of stack output. Pathway 4, the Tennant landfill. In the 1980s, DuPont needed a site for solid waste disposal, sludge from the digestion ponds, and concentrated C8 material too contaminated even for the pits. They purchased 66 acres from Wilbur Tennant, a fourth-generation cattle rancher whose property bordered Washington Works. DuPont assured Tennant the purpose was a non-hazardous landfill for municipal waste. What DuPont actually dumped was chemical waste, concentrated sludge, and toxic materials. Dry Run Creek flowed from the landfill through Tennant's grazing land and directly into the Ohio River. The economic calculations made in Wilmington's boardrooms finally found their targets in the fields of West Virginia. Chapter 6. The Discovery. The first signs of the apocalypse emerged in 1990, not in a lab, but on the Tennant farm. It became a scene of biological horror. Wilbur Tennant watched helplessly as his once docile herd transformed into aggressive monsters. The autopsy tapes he recorded reveal a nightmare: internal organs that had turned a chemically burnt neon green, lungs blackened by toxic inhalation, and teeth that had rotted into obsidian shards. This wasn't natural disease, it was a molecular invasion. Tennant was no longer running a farm. He was living in the epicenter of a chemical plague. By 1998, 153 cattle were dead, over half his herd, resulting in $1.2 million in losses. When Tennant complained, DuPont sent their own veterinarian, whose report concluded, "Nothing wrong with the landfill. The problem," the report stated, "must be Tennant's mismanagement, poor feeding, inadequate care." Tennant knew better. He had been ranching successfully for decades. The animals drank from Dry Run Creek, which was now cloudy, foamy, and metallic tasting, and then they died. In 1998, desperate and financially ruined, Tennant filed a lawsuit, Tennant versus DuPont. He sought a lawyer willing to challenge a chemical giant. He found Rob Bilott, a corporate defense attorney at Taft, Stettinius, and Hollister, whose career specialized in defending chemical companies. Taking Tennant's case was professional suicide, but Bilott watched Tennant's raw video footage, the blackened teeth, the destroyed internal organs. He took the case. Rob Bilott and the boxes. In 1999, Bilott filed a discovery motion demanding all DuPont documents related to the landfill and chemical disposal. DuPont lawyers stalled for months, claiming minimal documentation existed. When the judge ordered full production, the boxes arrived. 110,000 pages of internal reports, toxicology studies, blood monitoring data, contamination logs, and engineering assessments stacked floor to ceiling in Billett's Cincinnati office. Billett spent months immersing himself in the paper trail, and buried within those 110,000 pages, he found the truth that changed everything. The documents revealed that the contamination spread far beyond Tennant's farm. Water monitoring data showed C8 permeating the Ohio River, and distribution maps identified 6 public water districts affected. An estimated 70,000 people were exposed. Tennant's cattle were dying from C8 poisoning, but 70,000 people had been drinking that same poison for decades. The case was no longer about cows. It was about the largest chemical contamination of drinking water in American history. DuPont had known about the scale of the exposure for years, staying silent while cancers developed, while children were born, and while the chemical accumulated in the bodies of an entire population. As Bilott deciphered the ink on the pages, he realized he wasn't just looking at chemicals. He was looking at the silent occupation of 70,000 human bodies. The invisible harm, molecular accumulation. The discovery of the contamination documents was the legal beginning. The realization of what that meant to human biology was the harrowing reality. The story ceased being about corporate memos and became about flesh and blood, about permanent damage to the most intimate aspects of human biology. The harm was invisible. The victims did not know they were victims, and by the time they understood, the molecular damage was done. C8 entered human bodies through 4 primary routes. Route 1, drinking water, the primary pathway. 70,000 residents in 6 water districts drew contaminated water from the Ohio River or contaminated wells. Every glass, every cup of coffee, every meal cooked, every shower meant C8 entering the body. The chemical dissolved in the stomach, absorbed through the intestinal walls, and flowed into the bloodstream, without taste, sensation, or awareness. Route 2, inhalation. Workers at Washington Works breathed air containing C8 vapor, with high concentrations in production areas. Communities near the plant breathed outdoor air containing particulates from stack emissions. Exposure levels were lower for residents, but continuous over decades. Route 3, dermal absorption. Workers handling C8 powder absorbed it through the skin. C8's surfactant properties allowed it to penetrate tissue easily. Route 4, food chain contamination. Agricultural land contaminated by airborne deposition led to C8 in the soil. Plants absorbed it through their roots. Livestock consumed contaminated feed and water. The chemical concentrated in animal tissue, entering the human diet through vegetables, beef, and dairy products. 4 routes, 1 destination, the human blood. Once in the bloodstream, the C8 molecule bound to serum albumin, a transport protein in blood plasma. Attached to this protein, C8 circulated throughout the body, distributing itself to every organ and tissue, concentrating heavily in 3 key locations: the liver, the kidneys, and the blood itself. The liver, the body's detoxification center, accumulated C8 at exceptionally high levels. It attempted to process and break down the chemical, but failed. The robust carbon-fluorine bonds could not be cleaved. The chemical simply stayed, interfering with normal liver function and disrupting lipid metabolism. In the kidneys, the body's filtration system, C8 accumulated and interfered with normal function. While the kidneys tried to filter it out, most of the chemical was reabsorbed, cycling repeatedly and causing cumulative damage. Crucially, C8 had a half-life of 3.8 years in human blood. This meant that a single exposure would linger in the bloodstream for nearly 4 years before half of it was eliminated. With continuous exposure from drinking water, the chemical built up over decades, accumulating to dangerous levels without ever producing immediate symptoms or acute illness. This was the insidious nature of chronic poisoning. To bridge the gap between discovery and justice, Rob Bilott had to navigate a mountain of corporate secrets. But as he dug through the paper trail, he realized the true scale of the betrayal wasn't written in ink, but in the blood of 70,000 people. Chapter 7, the C8 Science Panel, Scientific Proof. The numbers are precise, but the pain is immeasurable. In the rolling hills of the Ohio River Valley, 69,030 human beings became the subjects of the largest epidemiological study in history. They weren't volunteers in a controlled laboratory. They were residents of a poisoned landscape, participants in a decades-long experiment they never signed up for. When the results of the C8 Health Project were finally tabulated between 2005 and 2012, they revealed a shocking scale of contamination that defied the limits of modern toxicology. For these 70,000 people, the discovery of C8 in their water wasn't just a legal milestone, it was a biological sentence. The median C8 level in their blood was 28.2 micrograms per liter, 10 times the national average. But for those living in the shadow of the Washington Works plant, the numbers soared into the thousands, with some reaching an atmospheric 22,000 micrograms per liter. These were not mere data points. They were the molecular signatures of a corporate betrayal that had rewritten the genetic future of an entire bloodline. The agony was rooted in a terrifying, multi-generational pattern. First, there were the veterans, the men and women who had dedicated 40 years to the plant, believing in the wizards of Wilmington. They retired with gold watches and the false security of a life well lived, only to find their mid-60s defined by the sudden, aggressive onset of kidney cancer. This was the cancer of long-term loyalty, the toxic debt of the 1960s finally coming due in the 2000s. Then,
There were their children, the generation born in the 1970s and 80s. They grew up on Happy Pans and DuPont-funded Little League teams, drinking glass after glass of cool, clear water that they now know was a toxic cocktail. Today, they are adults struggling with crippling thyroid diseases that drain their energy, alarmingly high cholesterol that requires lifelong medication, and the agonizing, bloody reality of ulcerative colitis. These are not acute illnesses that pass. They are chronic shadows that will follow them to their graves. Most heart-wrenching are the grandchildren. Born in the 2000s, many were tested as infants and toddlers during the C8 Health Project. They were contaminated before they could walk, before they could speak. The exposure didn't start at the kitchen tap. It started in the womb. Their mothers, unknowingly carrying the indestructible molecule, passed the toxic legacy through the placenta. These children were born pre-polluted, entering the world with a chemical burden that their bodies have no way to purge.
This created a horrific psychological landscape of agonizing uncertainty. For 70,000 people, every minor ailment became a source of terror. A persistent cough, a dull ache in the side, a routine blood test, everything raised the same inescapable question. Is this the C8? They are trapped in a state of biological suspense. They do not know if they will develop kidney cancer in 10 years, or if their child's inexplicable thyroid problem is a direct result of the water they provided with love 40 years ago. DuPont didn't just poison their water, they poisoned their peace of mind. They turned the fundamental act of nurturing, giving a child a glass of water, into an act of accidental harm. Human bodies in the Ohio River Valley were involuntarily transformed into storage units for DuPont's chemical waste. They became living repositories, biological archives of a corporate crime. This unwanted storage is permanent. Because C8 has a half-life of nearly 4 years in human blood and never degrades in the environment, the chemical in their veins today will likely be there when they take their last breath. Behind these harrowing statistics are the faces of the betrayed. There is Joe Kiger, a man who found himself with the cholesterol levels of an elderly patient while still in his prime, his body a map of a contamination he couldn't see. There is his wife, Darlene, whose life was dismantled by the relentless erosion of ulcerative colitis. And then there is Buck Bailey. Buck is the living, breathing exhibit A of the DNA of impunity. Born with a single nostril and a jaggedly distorted eye, Buck's face is a permanent record of the C8 his mother breathed and drank while working on the Teflon line. His childhood was not one of playgrounds, but of cold operating rooms and 30 reconstructive surgeries. DuPont's internal memos from 1981 documented the risk of birth defects, yet they chose silence. They filed the data in a cabinet and left Buck to face a lifetime of scars. The C8 Science Panel eventually delivered a verdict of probable links to 6 devastating diseases: kidney cancer, testicular cancer, ulcerative colitis, thyroid disease, pregnancy-induced hypertension, and high cholesterol. But the community knows the toll is wider. They see the clusters of breast cancer, the inexplicable liver failures, and the developmental delays in their children. They know that science often lacks the statistical significance to prove what a mother's intuition already confirms. This is the ultimate legacy of the Washington Works plant. It is a story of transfer of risk. DuPont reaped the billion-dollar profits of the Teflon revolution, while the people of Parkersburg, Little Hocking, and Lubeck paid the biological cost. They are the living evidence that for a century-old dynasty, some lives are simply not economically attractive to save. They remain trapped in their contaminated bodies, a population transformed into a monument of corporate indifference, waiting for a future that will never be truly clean. While 70,000 lives were being silently rewritten by a toxic molecule, a single lawyer was about to pull the first thread of a secret buried in a mountain of boxes. In 1999, Rob Bilott found himself at a crossroads that would redefine the rest of his life. He was a corporate defense attorney at Taft, Stettinius & Hollister, a firm known for protecting the very chemical giants he was now about to challenge. To his colleagues, Bilott was an anomaly. To DuPont, he was a traitor, but Bilott had seen Wilbur Tennant's videotapes, and he couldn't unsee the blackened teeth and the emerald-green livers of dying cattle. He knew that the only way to breach the financial bunker of Wilmington was to find the truth buried in DuPont's own records. He filed a discovery motion, demanding every document related to the Washington Works plant's waste disposal. DuPont's initial response was a classic deny-and-delay tactic, providing minimal, scrubbed data. But Bilott persisted. Finally, under court order, the floodgates opened. Hundreds of cardboard boxes began arriving at his office, eventually totaling over 110,000 pages of internal memos, confidential toxicology reports, and private correspondence. For months, Bilott lived in a world of paper. He sat alone in a room filled with the smell of old ink and corporate secrecy, painstakingly connecting the dots that DuPont thought would remain hidden forever. He wasn't just reading reports. He was witnessing a half-century of calculated silence. The paper trail began in 1961. Inside DuPont's Haskell laboratory, scientists had already concluded that PFOA-C8 was highly toxic. They observed liver enlargement in rats and rabbits at low doses. The report was stamped confidential. It was never shared with the public, and it was never disclosed to the workers handling the white powder every day. To the executives in Wilmington, this wasn't a warning. It was a managed risk. The deception escalated in 1962. An internal memo documented a disturbing cluster: 7 babies born to female employees in the Teflon division, 2 of whom had severe facial and eye defects. One of those children was Buck Bailey. DuPont's reaction was clinical and cold. They didn't call for a health crisis meeting or notify the EPA. Instead, they quietly moved the women off the production line and kept the data in a vault. They continued to use C8, prioritizing the non-stick revolution over the safety of the womb. By 1981, the contamination had moved from the factory floor to the river. DuPont's own water monitoring showed C8 levels in the Ohio River, spiking to 8 times the normal background concentration. This was the moment of no return. The smoking gun was a 1984 internal meeting where executives debated whether to invest $12 million in a carbon filtration system to scrub the chemical from the water. The minutes of that meeting are perhaps the most damning evidence in corporate history. They recorded the final verdict: reducing C8 emissions is not economically attractive. Bilott realized that DuPont had performed a grotesque cost-benefit analysis on human life. They calculated that the legal liabilities of the future were cheaper than the infrastructure of the present. But the most critical discovery arrived at the bottom of a box in late 1999. It was a massive environmental report containing detailed maps of the contamination plume. For the first time, Bilott saw the physical reach of the poison. The maps showed C8 seeping into the groundwater and infiltrating the aquifer that supplied 6 public water districts. The report estimated that 70,000 people were drinking this water every single day. This was the aha moment that changed everything. Bilott realized he wasn't just representing a farmer with dead cows. He was representing an entire population that had been biologically trespassed upon. In August 2001, Bilott launched a legal offensive, Leach versus DuPont, a class action lawsuit on behalf of those 70,000 residents. DuPont's response was a scorched earth campaign. They assembled an army of lawyers to bury Bilott in motions and technicalities. And they argued that C8 was not a regulated chemical, and therefore, no laws had been broken. It was a brilliant, hollow defense. C8 wasn't regulated because DuPont had never told the regulators it was dangerous. The battle became a war of attrition. Bilott's firm was small, their resources were draining, and DuPont's budget was bottomless. But Bilott had something they didn't: the 110,000 pages. He used their own words against them in hundreds of depositions, forcing scientists and managers to admit they had tracked the bioaccumulation in workers' blood for decades while telling the public the chemical was as harmless as salt. In 2004, the court certified the class action. DuPont, fearing a jury trial where Bilott would play his hand, offered a standard cash settlement. But Bilott knew that without scientific proof of exactly what C8 did to humans, a cash settlement was a trap. He made an unprecedented move. He told DuPont, "Keep your money for now. Give us science." He forced them to fund the C8 science panel. It was a high-stakes gamble. If the independent scientists found no link, the case would die. But Bilott trusted the paper trail. He had seen the rat studies from 1961. He knew what the science would say. This began a 7-year wait, a period of agonizing silence where 70,000 people waited to hear if the poison in their blood was a ticking time bomb. Bilott had navigated the mountain of secrets, but now he had to wait for the molecules to speak. For 7 long years, between 2005 and 2012, the Ohio River Valley lived in a state of biological suspense. While DuPont's lawyers waited for the excitement to die down, 3 independent epidemiologists, Tony Fletcher, David Savitz, and Kyle Steenland, were conducting a feat of scientific endurance. They were analyzing the blood, the medical histories, and the very lives of 69,030 people. This was the C8 Science Panel, and its mission was to answer the billion-dollar question: does this chemical cause human disease? The scale of the study was unprecedented, but so were the findings. When the blood results first came back, the numbers were staggering. The median C8 level in the community was 28.2 micrograms per liter, but in the highest exposure groups, the concentrations exceeded 22,000 micrograms per liter. These people weren't just exposed, they were saturated. They were living, breathing monuments to corporate negligence. Then, beginning in late 2011, the steel evidence began to drop like a series of gavel strikes. First came pregnancy-induced hypertension. The panel confirmed that C8 was crossing the placental barrier, threatening the lives of both mother and child before they even drew their first breath. Then came the cancers: kidney cancer and testicular cancer. The data showed that those with the highest exposure faced up to 3 times the risk of the general population. The miracle of Teflon was officially linked to the destruction of the human reproductive and filtration systems. By the time the panel concluded in October 2012, they had established 6 probable links: kidney cancer, testicular cancer, ulcerative colitis, thyroid disease, pregnancy-induced hypertension, and high cholesterol. 6 diseases, 6 scientific warrants. DuPont's halo of miracles was officially shattered. They could no longer hide behind the claim that C8 was as harmless as salt. Science had translated the 110,000 pages of internal deception into a medical reality that no lawyer could argue away. But the victory was bitter. For families like the Kiegers, the science arrived after the damage was done. For Buck Bailey, the panel's findings on pregnancy-related issues were a vindication of his mother's intuition, but they couldn't erase the scars from 30 surgeries. The science proved that DuPont had been running a human experiment for 50 years, and the results were devastating. The DNA of impunity faced its ultimate test in the courtrooms of 2015 and 2016, when juries finally sat across from the victims. When they heard the 1984 memo stating that filtration was not economically attractive, their reaction was swift. In case after case, juries awarded millions in damages. They saw the clinical detachment of the executives and responded with moral outrage. By early 2017, the financial bunker finally cracked. Facing thousands of pending lawsuits and a mountain of scientific proof, DuPont could no longer sustain the war of attrition. The legal battle that began with a single farmer was about to reach its ultimate financial conclusion. By early 2017, the financial bunker finally began to crack. Facing thousands of pending lawsuits and an irrefutable mountain of scientific proof, DuPont and its spin-off, Chemours, could no longer sustain their war of attrition. On February 13th, the silence was finally priced. A global settlement of $671 million. To the outside world, it looked like a monumental victory, the culmination of Rob Bilott's 18-year crusade and a long-awaited admission of value for the suffering of 3,500 victims. But in the cold, clinical calculus of Wilmington, this was not a defeat. It was a tactical retreat. If you look beneath the surface of the press releases, the settlement reveals a chilling financial irony. By choosing to pollute rather than filter back in 1984, DuPont had saved decades of capital. Now, the final bill represented a mere 2.7% of a single year's revenue. They had successfully turned a 60-year crime against humanity into a manageable line item on a balance sheet. A parking ticket on a Ferrari. The legal document ensured their immunity. DuPont admitted no wrongdoing and accepted no liability. They paid for the end of the scrutiny, not the end of the harm. While the corporation remained profitable, and its bloodline remained pure behind legal firewalls, the poison remained in the water, and the molecules remained in the blood. The science was the steel evidence of their guilt, but the settlement was the ultimate testament to their untouchability. To understand the irony, one must look at the scale. On the day the settlement was announced, DuPont's stock price didn't plummet in shame. It rose. Wall Street analysts, who had factored in a potential loss of over $1 billion, breathed a sigh of relief. The $671 million was manageable. It was, in the language of Wilmington, a successful mitigation of risk. For 64 years, DuPont had reaped billions in profits from Teflon. By choosing not to install the $12 million filtration system in 1984, they had saved hundreds of millions in cumulative capital and interest. When the bill finally came due in 2017, the settlement represented roughly 2.7% of DuPont's revenue for that single year. It was a parking ticket on a Ferrari. The corporation had successfully privatized the massive profits of the Teflon revolution while socializing the biological cost among 70,000 human storage units. The most disturbing aspect of the settlement was the no liability clause. Despite 110,000 pages of evidence, despite 6 probable links to deadly diseases, and despite 3 decades of calculated silence, in the legal document stated that DuPont admitted no wrongdoing. There were no handcuffs, no executives stood in a dock, no corporate charter was revoked. The system allowed the bloodline of the company to remain pure, protected by the very dynasty trusts and legal firewalls they had perfected over a century. This is the financial irony. The legal system worked exactly as it was designed, not to prevent the poisoning, but to price it. The settlement effectively turned a crime against humanity into a cost of doing business. DuPont and its spin-off, Chemours, simply moved the numbers from one column to another on a spreadsheet. They paid for the right to have poisoned a population, and in doing so, they bought a legal end to the scrutiny. But, for the people of Parkersburg, the settlement is a misnomer. You cannot settle a molecular debt that never expires. You cannot settle with a chemical that has a half-life of thousands of years. The money did not remove the C8 from the blood of the grandchildren. It did not undo the 30 surgeries on Buck Bailey's face. It did not bring back the workers who died of kidney cancer in the decades before Rob Bilott opened the first box of documents. The corporation walked away with its profits intact, rebranded and restructured, while the victims remained trapped in their own biology, living, breathing archives of a chemical occupation that will outlast the very banks where the settlement money was deposited. This is the ultimate legacy of the Washington Works plant. It proved that, in the modern era, immortality is not achieved through legacy or art, but through chemistry and capital. When the poison is immortal in the water, the profit is immortal in the bunker, and the impunity is immortal in the law. The Ohio River continues to flow, a silent witness to a betrayal that was not just economically attractive, but legally invincible. But the ultimate victory of the financial bunker was not measured in dollars saved, but in the prison cells that remained empty.
Chapter 8: Structural Immortality. Crucially, no criminal charges were ever filed. No executives were prosecuted, not for the concealment of toxicity data, not for the contamination of the drinking water, not for the decades of knowing and choosing profit over safety, not even for the fraud inherent in obtaining discharge permits through concealment or failing to report to the EPA in violation of TSCA requirements. Only civil penalties were issued. The 2005 EPA settlement of $16.5 million for failing to disclose C8 health information. At the time, this was the largest EPA civil penalty ever issued. But compared to DuPont's 2004 profit of $2.8 billion, the fine represented 0.6% of annual profit.
The cost of poisoning 70,000 people was less than 1% of 1 year's profit. This is how accountability worked in practice. Civil settlements, no admissions, no criminal consequences, and corporate restructuring to shield assets. The executives who made the damning decisions, who read the 1961 toxicity reports, who saw the 1981 birth defect memo, who approved the 1984 not economically attractive note, retired wealthy, with full pensions and their professional reputations intact within their industries. None went to prison. None faced criminal charges. None were even individually sued. The corporation paid a fractional fee. The individuals walked free. This was the profound truth that was exposed. DuPont had knowingly poisoned 70,000 people for 64 years, had concealed the evidence, and had chosen profit over safety at every decision point, in every board meeting. And the final punishment was a rounding error on the balance sheet. The truth was exposed, but justice was not served. $671 million sounds substantial, but calculate the real lifetime cost. Medical expenses for kidney cancer can exceed $1 million lifetime. Add lost wages, pain and suffering, the reduced life expectancy, and the years stolen. Time with grandchildren never experienced. The money did not come close to compensating the losses. Furthermore, the settlement applied only to people who had already developed disease by 2017. What about people who develop cancer in 2025 or 2030? Latency periods can extend 30, 40, or 50 years. Future claims were technically allowed, but the burden of proof remained entirely on individuals, many of whom won't have the resources to pursue legal action against a corporate giant. Justice remained incomplete. The deepest failure was the lack of criminal accountability. Why? The corporate structure diffused responsibility. Decisions were made collectively, allowing everyone involved to claim they were following procedures and to rely on plausible deniability. The compliance defense: we operated within our permits. C8 wasn't regulated, everything was legal, succeeded because regulations didn't exist, only because DuPont concealed the critical information. When the EPA assessed the civil fine, it was treated as trivial white-collar crime, under-prosecuted because corporate environmental violations are technical and complex, and prosecutors prefer clearer crimes. Resources matter. DuPont could afford unlimited defense, dragging cases for years. Regulatory capture played its role. Industry political influence, massive campaign contributions, lobbying power, and a revolving door between the EPA and the chemical sector. The result is a system where corporations commit massive environmental crimes, poison tens of thousands, conceal the evidence for decades, and face only civil fines that are rounding errors. The corporate restructuring in 2015 created Chemours. Washington Works was transferred, and with it, the liability. DuPont emerged clean, a legal standard strategy, but one that left the victims to die carrying C8 while the perpetrators retired wealthy. The corporation, structurally immortal, continues. Washington Works is still operating today, producing 150,000 tons of product annually. While C8 was supposedly phased out in 2015, monitoring continues to show ongoing PFOA releases. The legacy contamination is permanent. Groundwater contamination is irreversible. The Ohio River contamination is still detectable. Cleanup is technically impossible. Meanwhile, the water treatment filters installed to remove the poison cost residents $1.5 million per year per district. The victims pay twice, once with their contaminated blood and again with the bills to filter the poison. What we still don't know is the full scope of the health effects. The science panel studied 55 outcomes and found 6. But C8 affects multiple biological systems. Latency means effects are still emerging. Children exposed in utero are only now reaching cancer ages. But the biological trespass did not stop at the borders of Parkersburg. Chapter 9: An Eternal Epitaph. The ultimate scope of global contamination is staggering. The chemical has traveled through the water cycle to the ends of the Earth. Researchers have detected C8 in the blood of polar bears in the Arctic and in the tissue of marine life in the deep Pacific. Even in the most remote wilderness, untouched by human hands, the chemical signature of DuPont remains. How many people have been exposed worldwide? How much PFAS was released in total? There are 10,000 to 15,000 PFAS chemicals, the forever chemicals, in existence, yet only 2 are globally banned. Can PFAS ever truly be removed from the environment? Will future generations forgive this generation for what we allowed? The central horrifying question remains: how does society allow a corporation to knowingly poison 70,000 people for profit and face no criminal consequences? The answer is in the system itself. Fines are too small. Regulations are too weak. Settlements are negotiable. Liability is transferable. Executives are insulated. Corporations are structurally immortal. The factory can close. Buildings can be demolished and equipment scrapped, but the poison remains. In groundwater flowing for millennia, in river water carrying contamination downstream for centuries, and in human blood passing from mother to child, generation after generation. Today, 98% of Americans have PFAS in their blood right now, including you, including children born today. This is DuPont's true legacy. Not Teflon-coated pans, not nylon stockings, not miracle materials, but the permanent global poisoning of planet Earth. Eleuthère Irénée DuPont arrived in America in 1800, seeking freedom and opportunity. His company became an American icon, synonymous with innovation, jobs, and prosperity, but chose profit over people, deception over disclosure, and poison over safety for 64 years. The cost: 70,000 poisoned people, billions of contaminated humans, one poisoned planet forever. Better living through chemistry became humanity's epitaph, written in contaminated blood that will never run clean. This is the dark, true story of DuPont's chemical factory. This is the enduring cost of American industry. This is the poison legacy we all inherit, and it will last forever.